And comment about the proposed historic district downtown. So roll call. Oh, we need the pledge first. Okay, well, pledge allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Roll call.
Yeah, I'll start with the Planning Commission first. Les Russell.
Here.
Member Drobish. Member Friend. Member List. Member Lowry. Historical Advisory Committee. Chair Harkey. Here. Vice Chair Wolf. Here. Secretary Rogers. Here. Member Hardy.
Entertain the adoption of the agenda.
Any of you can.
We have a second? All in favor, say aye. Thank you. This is time for public comment, which would be for items or item that's not on our agenda. It wouldn't be pertaining to the historic district, but if anybody has something they'd like to talk to the Planning Commission about, I don't have the whole paragraph here, but we don't want any slanderous items and, well, anyway, does anybody have any comments or that doesn't apply to our agenda tonight? Seeing none, we'll move on. Do we have a staff report about this item, or are we just going?
We don't. Ms. Boyer has some PowerPoint slides which we'll present.
Okay. So we'll have the speaker then.
You might want to move.
I'm looking directly
Yeah, the big white way.
We'll introduce our speaker then. Matt, if you're gonna, give us a breakdown or a little history of this.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission and the committee. My name is Matt Boyer. I'm a consultant from here in El Dorado County. Is that better? I can speak closer. I'm Matt Boyer. Can you guys hear me now? It's on. I just think it's on really low.
Just talk closer.
How about that? Yeah. Okay. I'm Matt Boyer. I'm a consultant from here in the county, a volunteer project manager to the Placerville Downtown Association, working on the local efforts to complement Benjamin Moore's Main Street Matters program. So I thought I would just give you a quick overview of what Benjamin Moore's program encompasses, and more importantly, maybe what our complementary community program is. And so without further ado, if we want to just hit the next slide, Andrew, there's really a couple things I want to do today. Just give you a quick background, talk about the Benjamin Moore project, talk about the Downtown Association's work, give you an idea of what's going to be happening over the next several months, and then most importantly, answer questions that you might have from your two different roles in terms of this project and the reasons that you're here tonight. In terms of background, I think you all know last spring, Benjamin Moore ran a contest through social media across North America for communities to be selected for a repainting of a portion of their historic main streets. And 20 communities in North America were selected. Most of those are in the United States. There's a couple that are in Canada. And since that time, Benjamin Moore has been going across the country, planning and painting a section of the main streets of each of these towns. And they've done maybe a half dozen or so to this point. Placerville and Martinez are the two towns in California. We're sort of at the end of their schedule. We do have some building code requirements related to handling of existing lead-based paint on buildings, and so it makes their work in California a little bit more complicated than the other states. But I think that's actually working out to our benefit. It's given us a little bit more time to interact with them, and I think overall it's going to be positive in terms of what the end result for our project is. One of the things that Benjamin Moore's found, and I think we all know this, is each community is a little bit different. So they started with some general program guidelines, and as they've gone to each community, they've realized that one size doesn't fit all, and you all know that from your various activities. But they're basic, and if we go to the next slide, Andrew, if I could go one more, sorry, I didn't prompt you. You know, their basic program was to do the main street frontages of buildings. Their preference is to do the lowest story of those buildings, which I think has as much to do with extending their budget as far across as many buildings as possible. And 2 to 3 blocks, which is probably the parameter that works the least well for Placerville, because 2 or 3 blocks would essentially be from, you know, Camino to Missouri Flat Road. For context, obviously Bedford Avenue to Sacramento Street is essentially 1 block, and I don't think in any community that they've looked at painting more than approximately 20 buildings, and we've got about 63 buildings just in that 1 block. So for context, a lot of main streets have much more, you know, shorter traditional quarter-mile or even shorter blocks. We have 1 very, very large block, and they're committed to using local contractors that are certified in the handling of any pre-existing lead-based paint. We did get them to focus on the entire Sacramento Street to Bedford Avenue section. We think that's appropriate, and we're very, very happy that they are testing for the presence of lead in all the buildings in that section. They're just about wrapped up with that process. It's quite an extensive and lengthy process to do the testing and then do the analysis, because it's not only the presence of lead, but it's the amount and the number of layers, and that gets into the complexity of what the contractor has to do during the painting. So if we go to the next slide, that gives you a little bit about the Benjamin Moore project. Their schedule says that sometime in June they would start and finish the painting. It's probably about a 3-week painting effort. So more exciting for me is this idea of what we could do as a local community to leverage off of this great once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And it was July when we found out that our town had been selected for the program, and I called Lisa the next day and I said, you know, got this crazy idea that rather than just take that gift, what if I volunteered and managed a larger community effort and see what other things we might do around the repainting? Because the repainting is a great part of the aesthetic, but there's so many other things in the built environment that really complement that, whether it's things related to the street itself or the sidewalks or the gateways into town, etc. So the first thing that we did was, in partnership with the Mountain Democrat, we developed a Main Street Matters pledge form, and many of you may have seen this. The Mountain Democrat was kind enough to give us ad space and published it at no cost to anybody. And we got about 30 responses just from that form in the newspaper. We had a community meeting in January, and if we want to go to the next slide, in the December-January timeframe, we had already started to garner a lot of community group interest from 4-H, the Cooperative Extension Program, the County Office of Education, the El Dorado Union High School District, and the Key Club and other student groups, and then many of the local service clubs. Just today I met with Motherlode Rehabilitation, which is interested in some of their existing clients also being part of this, and vendors have started to weigh in that they'd be willing to work with businesses on some discounted programs for things like awning replacement. If 5 or 6 businesses have fabric awnings that need to be replaced in kind, they'd be willing to provide some group discount prices. So we went to the community, we said, okay, with this as the context of the program, we don't want to be presumptuous that the community wants to do something more, but we also don't want to lose this opportunity. So without prompting a whole lot beyond who, what, where, when, why, how, what would you like to see happen or not? And we had a great half an hour or so discussion with about 75 people in the room that were a combination of building owners, business owners, and just folks from the community at large. And we ended up with 31 discrete items of input, and I've summarized these in the next couple of slides. I won't necessarily go through this in detail. If you want to go to the next one, Andrew, there we go. They're on 2 sheets, but basically they fell into 11 different categories. The main focus people came that night thinking about was additional painting. So whatever buildings within Sacramento Street to Bedford, maybe even further down Main Street in both directions. There's more buildings that could be painted, certainly some that need it more than others. There also is the element of what about upper stories if there's only first stories of certain buildings that might be selected as part of the Benjamin Moore project. What about the rear side faces of buildings that face Highway 50, because that's a huge attractant to people into our downtown. There were some other ideas in terms of non-painting facade features, wood, iron, other historic features, some electrical related ideas that were really out of the box. There was a point about, you know, all of our local events, everybody brings their own PA system downtown. What if we had an integrated PA system that was built into the buildings and was accessible to everybody? How might that be utilized to the benefit of our community? Landscape, streetscape, infrastructure repair, everything from filling some and grinding some of the cracks in the sidewalk, the repaving of Main Street if that's possible, giving some TLC to the parking garage, and maybe to finish up on the second slide, maybe some additional signs on the building surfaces, either related to the building ownership or the building history or the tenants, some other wayfaring signs to kind of guide tourists and other non-local folks through some of the historic landmarks. Marketing and media was just to say, wouldn't it be great if we could capture in high definition photography and video this transformation, and if we did nothing other than store that, how that could be used for tourism by the Chamber, the Visitors Bureau, etc., for other purposes down the road, and a few other random other ideas that people had. So my job, which is not quite as easy as I thought it would be, is to start connecting the dots between these work program ideas that people had and the individuals, the groups that have expressed some interest in donating labor, discounted materials, etc. But I finally came up with a format a couple of days ago that's going to work really well. We have a community meeting next week, which I'll talk about in a minute, where we're going to start bringing those two ends of the puzzle together and asking people, okay, is this sort of what you said you were interested in, and here's how it might look. And the vision in the back of my mind is to say, have we returned to an era where we do the old-fashioned barn raising? You know, we've lived through decades of, you know, most community improvements were driven by the government. That's really not the economic reality of local government today, and it's not necessarily in keeping with the history of our town, or even sort of the way that our local community views problems. We're more of a, see a problem, fix the problem ourselves, and we want to give people an opportunity to see what that might look like. We think some of these things are very doable in the next 3 or 4 months. Some of them are probably doable in one weekend, simultaneous with the reveal of the final painting, and some of them might be work program things that are either ongoing in perpetuity or that are going to take 18 or 24 months to really plan and do. But I'm really interested in seeing the feedback that we get at this next community meeting. Then give you an idea of the next steps from Benjamin Moore's standpoint. They're finishing up the lead paint testing and the analysis. They're getting bids from local contractors. They'll use the bids to compare to their project budget, and they'll figure out how far their budget can stretch. And I'm guessing that they'll pick, you know, many buildings in sort of one grouping so it has the maximum reveal aha value. They'll hire the contractors to fulfill their scope. Their work will include not just the painting, but the restorative work to wood and other surfaces to make sure that it's not lipstick on the proverbial pig, but it's really quality workmanship like you would do if this was your home or your building. They will review the color palette with each of the building owners, and they'll have their own paint specialists make some recommendations, but they'll also provide an option, I understand, to the building owners to do something in the tones and hues of the existing. So there'll be a couple of choices for the building owners to have. We think the painting will happen in the June timeframe, beginning and ending, and the Downtown Association, in partnership with some of the community groups, is starting to plan what that final celebration would look like. That's tentatively June 21st from approximately 4 to 7, so it's sort of at the end of the afternoon. 4 to 7? End of the afternoon. It's been a long day. 4 to 7, end of the afternoon, kind of keep people around for dinner and help lead into a really great night. So if any of you listening or here would like to help, and maybe we'll go to the next slide, the Downtown Association's website has the Main Street Matters pledge form for individuals or groups that are interested in being part of this. It has the statement of interest for vendors that might be interested with materials or services. You also can contact me directly, and I think you can find my information also on the Placerville Downtown Association website. The easiest way to get a hold of me is to email me, but my phone number is on there too, and you're welcome to call me. We certainly want this to be as broad-based a community effort as possible. And then finally, for us locally, we're having the follow-up community meeting next Monday. Unfortunately, there's no space in all of March and April here downtown to have the meeting, so the Office of Education was kind enough to give us the really large conference room just outside of town at the corner of Missouri Flat and Green Valley Road. We're going to hopefully have the same 75 or more people there to talk about this work program and see how we might refine it and start setting up some weekend and after work parties to some really cool things here in town. The other thing is Benjamin Moore is interested in donating a historic street sign that looks something like the image in the lower corner there. So we're looking for a location in the downtown district that's appropriate for that sign, and we've got some preliminary ideas, and that's something that I'll be working on in the next couple of weeks. So a little bit about Benjamin Moore's program, a little bit about our complementary efforts, and happy to answer any questions. Mr. Wolf.
Is this just really like Scout Hall or
Turn it on. Okay. I was just curious about just to kind of get a handle on the scope of the project. On what's the overall cost or contribution from Benjamin Moore? How, not quite sure what the question is, but
Yeah,
just
no,
what's the scope?
They've got their own budget, and they've got their complete control of their work program, so they actually aren't giving us those details, and they haven't in other communities either. So I'm really not sure what to expect beyond those basic parameters that they gave us in terms of 2 to 3 standard city blocks, 20 to 30 buildings, front. So we could all guess what that would equate to dollar-wise, but we don't know. In terms of the complementary efforts, we're starting with the idea that the things that are most doable is with volunteer labor and donated materials, etc. We do have a few groups, which I won't name because they haven't made a final decision, that have been interested potentially in actually providing some cash that would be able to be used to procure services and materials that can't be fully donated.
I noticed that on one of the slides it mentioned their process for hiring contractors. So if they're hiring contractors, what are the volunteers going to do?
So the idea would be for their scope of work, they'll pick buildings that they would like to have repainted with their resources. They'll hire the contractors to do that. This complementary work program is really to deal with things like power washing the sidewalks. On the extraordinary end, the city's contemplation of repaving Main Street, some of the work to trim trees, clear brush on the gateways into town, maybe look at additional painting resources to paint the backsides of the Highway 50 facades of buildings that would be outside of Benjamin Moore's scope. Yep. Yeah. Swap out this. How's that? Any better? Yeah.
Very well. So.
Okay. Other questions? I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
This is going to be very informal. First off, I want to thank the Historic Advisory Committee for doing the work that they've done to, can we turn that thing off?
Video's coming up next.
Oh, okay. So we're going to talk about the historic district now. We're finished with the painting. Okay.
Questions from the public.
Any comments from the public about the painting program before we move on? Again, I want to thank the Historic Committee for working on this. I know it's taken some time, so that means that it wasn't just a slam dunk. Is there someone from the Historic Committee that would kind of like to give us a background of how you went about this and your process of coming up with what you're proposing?
You. No. Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Anyway, when our committee was initially adopted, we got together. We were kind of going, okay, well, what are we going to do with this? At that particular point, there wasn't any conversation about the making the city registered historical district or so forth, but we kind of, what can we do to make a difference? What we could do to possibly stimulate the tourist travel here, get more interest into the city and so forth. So that was our basic number 1 goal. And then we've been kind of evolving into where we're at now and so forth. So, you know, we have, you know, like we have a couple of either Peter or Joanne. Either one, would you like to possibly? You know, I was just telling about when we initially got going here and so forth, what our goal was.
Right.
And so.
I think right off the bat, it was to, number 1, preserve and work on the historic district. And that's evolved, and we've been doing that since 2012. I can't remember the month. Was it April somewhere? June. And after doing a lot of research on the different, not only the websites, but within our own past experiences with the first advisory committee, they developed the residential historic sites in the neighborhoods like Cedar Ravine, etc. And so we felt it was our job to connect those with our business historic district. And so that's sort of where the goal is tonight, is to show you a movie that the Carey House manager, Mr. Hardy, has put together, and we've all kind of come together and worked on that, which you'll see shortly. So I think that's what we should do now. Do you want to do the?
There's not a lot to introduce. You basically watch it. This is just kind of a compilation of the discussions that the committee had, I think. Not a very good one.
Good morning. My name is Sam Clemens, but most of you might know me better as Mark Twain. I want to thank your association for giving a couple of us old-timers a spot on your agenda today to speak about the proposal to officially designate parts of your downtown as a historic district. We'd like to talk a little about the suggested boundaries, the process, and the impact it may have on all of you as business and property owners. With our few minutes, we will try to answer some questions and maybe address some concerns that might be out there. By the way, before we start, please don't tell anyone at the hotel I've been smoking up here. They get really touchy about it. I've asked a few of my old friends to stop by and help me. First up is John Studebaker. What have you got for us, Johnny?
Hi, Mark. I think we should start by telling everyone a little about the Historic Advisory Committee. It was created in 2011 and serves only in an advisory capacity, working with the city planner and other city officials. It consults primarily with the Planning Commission and City Council with respect to the identification and preservation of the community's historic resources. The committee first started preparing a draft for a downtown district back in 2012. That's the proposed district we'll be talking about today.
Mr. Studebaker, you know the city already has 4 historic districts. They're all residential areas, and they've been in place since 1981. There's the Coloma Spring Street District, the Sacramento Chamberlain Street District, the Bedford Avenue and Clay Street District, and over here, the Cedar Ravine Historical District.
Mark, can I go next? Hello everyone. My name is Lola Montez. Now that Mark has discussed the boundaries of the existing residential historic districts, I'd like to tell you a little about the proposed district that would cover downtown. Let's take a look. The proposed boundaries for the district would extend the full length of Main Street, along with portions of Pacific and Sacramento streets. To the west, it would begin near the 1906 bridge.
So along with the bridge, this would capture the old O'Keefe residence and Toll House. That's right, until around 1886, Michael O'Keefe used to operate the road into town as a tollway. Then, he moved up the street and became an undertaker.
Mark, you're so good at stories, but we only have a few more minutes, so we better keep moving along.
You're right. Unfortunately, no time to dilly-dally. Let's go.
Traveling east, the boundary ends at the corner of Main and Broadway. So, among others, this upper boundary would include the Samuel Turner residence that was built around 1888. Plus, 4 more houses on Cedar Ravine are being added to that residential district you talked about earlier. Overall, the district includes the oldest commercial properties in town and nearly 50 buildings listed on the city's historic resource inventory. Plus, 4 state landmarks, and of course, the Bell Tower and Druid Monument.
You're right. These buildings do have a lot of stories to tell, and it seems that a historic district might be the best way to preserve those stories as the community continues to grow and evolve over time. But I told the folks we'd try to answer some questions, so let me ask a few now.
Would all the buildings in the district be protected from ever being demolished?
Landmark, or historic designation, in California, ensures a more thorough review of demolition proposals under the state's Environmental Quality Act. The state requires that other alternatives be explored, but a determined property owner may eventually gain approval.
Will creating a historic district reduce property values?
Property values across the nation have actually increased with historic designation, both for residential and commercial. And the designation acts to protect the investments made to such properties.
Would I be able to make changes to my property?
Significant changes can be made. Historic preservation laws are not meant to prevent changes, but to manage them. Typically, the Secretary of the Interior's standards are used as guidelines.
Will it have an impact on business downtown?
Throughout the nation, historic designation has shown to stimulate business, specifically what is called heritage tourism. When a community has a specific identity and exhibits it well, it attracts not only tourists, but new businesses as well.
Is preservation more expensive than new construction?
Typically, preservation is more cost-effective than new construction. Federal grants and tax incentive programs also exist to assist in preserving historic structures. Plus, restored materials can often be a more environmentally green method to use.
Are individual property rights being violated?
Well, when living in any community, there are local laws and ordinances that exist that are for the benefit of all.
Would this send a signal that the city was against progress and change?
Preservation is not about stopping change. It's about keeping our past heritage while new architecture and development properly coexist.
How else might this benefit the community?
A community that values its history is one that is generally attractive to live and work in. As you said, Mark, these buildings and their stories are a record of our past. They provide a richness and depth to our everyday life.
Well, that was a lot of questions, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot more. You might as well come on back to the meeting. The committee can make sure everyone here has a copy of the proposed map, and we'll start to wrap this up. While we're waiting for Mark and Lola, let me update you a little on the status of the district proposal. On February 25th, the City Council passed a resolution instructing the city staff to initiate the formal process involved with amending the current downtown zoning map. This means they'll start an environmental review and submit an application to the Planning Commission, and they will make a recommendation to the City Council. It's important to know that the public will have an opportunity to make comment during that 30-day environmental review, during the Planning Commission's review, and also during the City Council's review period. So you'll have plenty of chances to ask questions and speak up.
I know this has been a lot of information in only a few minutes. I wish we'd had time to show every building, but we couldn't. As General Grant mentioned, there's going to be plenty of chances during the continuing deliberations for your questions and comments. In fact, your input will be most welcome. Thank you for giving us your attention.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, here, okay, yeah, we're opening up the questions here.
I was just wondering what, how you chose the proposed boundaries there, any comparison to the 80s when they were talking about a larger district. How did you choose these boundaries?
Well, in my recollection, when we started on the west end, and we were thinking about the buildings there, once you get past the old toll house, it kind of, ends, but then that bridge was a very important, the bridge was a very important asset to the city of Placerville, so we decided at that end, on the west end, that would be a good place to start. Going beyond there, we've got the new freeway overpasses and this and that, and kind of going down into Placerville Drive. So, and then, excuse me, on the other end, I kind of looked at that. The buildings that, will go up to the end of Upper Main there, so forth, seem to be built in earlier periods than if you go up towards Broadway. So they seem to be more modern structures and so forth. So that was kind of our guidelines for that. So. Any other questions?
Is anybody in the audience that would like to come up and ask a question or make a comment? This is really going to be pretty informative, so it's not a public hearing. So go ahead and state your name.
Name, address, and telephone number. Evelyn Vierkamp. A couple of the questions that were answered on the video kind of gave ambiguous answers. For example, and probably understandably so, but one of the questions was in respect of to the extent it would, to the extent that being in the historical, I'm wanting to call it the Historical Advisory Committee district, the historical, whatever you call it, district. To what extent would that inhibit property owners from doing whatever modifications they wanted to their properties? And the answer was basically, well, we all live and have regulations for the common good. Doesn't really answer the question as to what limitations will be placed on property owners. And I would think that would be a question that everybody affected would want to have an answer to. What will be the restrictions on property owners, and will they have other, additional layers of bureaucracy to have to get through, additional time lags, additional expenses? And I speak not as an affected property owner, but that would be my question if I were an affected property owner.
Member Rogers, could you help us with that, please?
Okay. Can I? I've just have compared the Department of the Interior standards for historic preservation with our own City of Placerville Development Guide, and this one is 93, but there's a new one coming out that's very similar. And I found that all of the, most of the changes and the laws, guidelines are all we have been operating under already. There are 7 chapters in here regarding the architecture, signage, the method on, for example, if you had a building and you wanted to add a balcony, those regulations are in here. And of course, all the safety, electrical, things like that. We've been operating that way. Some of the nuances on how to treat, for example, a metal railing and how to remove the old paint or how to paint it or not to paint it, those detail things are in the historical guide with the Department of the Interior. But I would say 90% anyway of the laws we have been already operating under.
Yeah, Mr. Wolf.
Yeah, I think it was. That's an excellent question. I think it's just going to kind of be a question of degree, though. I mean, should the city adopt this downtown district, the design guidelines that Joanne is talking about, most of which are already in place, will kind of guide what how a building owner or property owner addresses doing new construction or renovation work, and it's. The heart of the whole thing, in my view, would be the design guidelines. There's not going to be some new review body or anything other than what we already have, where some projects kind of start out at our committee, the Historic Preservation Advisory Committee, and then wind their way through the Planning Commission and the City Council. It'd be probably pretty much the same. But I think it's an excellent question, because as an architect, I've been on that side of the podium a lot as an applicant, and it is a really good question. Like, how many extra steps and hoops and time and money are going to be added to this? But I can go out on a limb, and my personal opinion is I don't think it'll be much.
I think that some of the things that might change a little bit would be things that are dealing with EPA because of their changes and so forth, as far as dealing with, disposal and this and that. That's a big deal. And that changes, it's just got everybody kind of, by the what. So, but anyway, so yeah, that makes it a little tough. But most of the other guidelines, they're pretty solid and have been there, set in place for quite some time.
Chris Payne. I'm president of the El Dorado County Historical Society, and recently I got appointed to District 38, regional vice president of the Conference of California Historical Societies, which is more statewide. So I've had discussions about this proposal from the perspective of the property owner, from the perspective of a tourist, from the perspective of some people who are very interested in creating this district and some people who are not. And so to summarize what I've discussed is the question of standards versus guidelines. Certainly this proposal is shifting from an intent of this is what we would like to see happen to this is what will happen. And so that's kind of a regulatory perspective on how far should we go, and what is the sensitivity we have to personal property rights and those things. I think it's a tough decision because we know that this proposal in the past did not succeed, and we have been left many years without anything of substance. I own 327 Main Street. You look at it right now, people say it's a great building, it's a lovely building. But I've seen then and now, Placerville then and now, and I know that it was a twin to the Heyday Cafe, the Tracy building. And so there's only a little bit of the facade that's left that matches. So some point along the line, the former owner got the city to give him a permit to create that grand room, which I love inside, all beams showing, to the outside, which became brick, as we have it right now, and the windows were modified accordingly, the doorways modified accordingly. So I'm kind of looking at it from both perspectives, the property owner, and making sure whatever we come up with seems to be realistic, because I am a property owner, and from being involved with the historical societies and my involvement with wanting to do the right thing for preservation and not wanting to see buildings tore down if it's possible to save them. So I think that's generally how I feel about it. I'm looking for the final decisions related to the details, because it's in the details that people can then draw their final decision, and we can get it approved or not get it approved based on that. So I'm glad you're having this joint meeting. I appreciate this discussion, since the Planning Commission is extremely important in any project approval, and that's my comments. Thank you.
Stan Morris, Historical and Cultural Preservation Projects. I'm interested in what the timeline is for this designation, the historic district, and is this something, a designation that'll be just done in the city council, through the city council, or is this a state or a national designation? That what are the, as I understood in those early meetings that I sat in on, that there was quite a lot to doing this, to getting this designation, although maybe there's another way to do it at a city level, municipal level?
Well, maybe I can address the process question. What steps are, that's actually coming up. Bear with us, it's actually after this discussion item. But specifically to whether or not this is a local or state or a federal registered downtown district, I don't know if our body has so declared it so, but my understanding is it's just a local designation at this time. I know our committee may talk about additional steps if the city is interested in actually adopting this or something similar, or a modification of what's proposed tonight. There might be further discussion by the Historical Advisory Committee and perhaps the Planning Commission and City Council about maybe a federal or a state designation as well. There's a few more extra hoops and steps that need to go through in order for that designation to occur. The local designation is the easiest for local governments to get approved, because all it involves is the legislative body determining it so. If you go to a state or federal registration district, then there are other agencies outside the city that would weigh in on whether or not it's appropriate and can be deemed such. So that could involve much more background information that we may need to provide to them should the city want to move forward in that direction. It's kind of a long-winded answer, but...
It's excellent, Andrew. And the timeline, 6 months?
Well, I don't think staff has a particular time frame as to when we're going to ultimately get this up to the council. But as the video mentioned, and I'm about to describe the process, there will be opportunities for the public to comment. Once staff, if you want, I can move right into that, but I think there might be some other questions out there, but we will get to that. We will get to that.
Thank you.
Sure.
we're really looking at, because we've mentioned two different guidelines were kind of mentioned. It's the Department of Interior, and I had some issues how some of those were interpreted by our, some of them are a little vague, and so they need to be spelled out maybe a little bit better and then included into the city guidelines, if that's where we're going. But I think we talked about two different things that we're looking at for guidelines or standards, and I like those things to be very clear so that we do know what we're talking about. If they're kind of vague guidelines, it leaves it up to the interpretation of the board at the time, which becomes very subjective to property owners and can be very nerve-wracking. The other is, this says no action will be taken tonight, so when will be action? I mean, are you tonight talking about whether you want to move forward with action? I think you kind of addressed that with Stan's question, but I'm not sure. And at that point, will each building owner be notified that this is where I mean, it's almost like I think there's two building owners, maybe three that are here. It would be nice that each, and we know because we're in the know that this stuff's going on. So if we're going to do this, will each property owner be notified of a meeting? Would be good to know. And then I think number 4, you know, it would have been nice if 80 years ago we had a culture in this community that wanted to preserve our history. You look at Sutter Creek or Murphy's or Nevada City, a lot of those towns really, it was almost a culture of wanting to preserve what they had, and you go into those communities and they are so much like what they were in the 1800s. So much of our town, I think in 1940 they went through and remodeled everything. So when you talk about state or federal designations, we actually had the state look at our buildings, and because so much had been done to alter the big building, it wouldn't even qualify. So you know, those are some things that are good to know. And then the phrase that kind of made me nervous is that the new can coexist with the old, and I remember when they were discussing the ketchup and mustard buildings and they wanted to put a new window in, and they were told it should be oval so it stands out from the old. That kind of makes me nervous to have that type of standards, because I really think we should blend with what's existing. If we really want to retain that historic flavor, it should be more historical. So I think that's most of my questions. Thanks.
Andrew, I don't want to short circuit the process description. So if you're going to cover this, stop me. What would be helpful for?
Okay.
You got me. You got me. That's quite an accomplishment. Ask my wife. Yeah. What I hear us about to embark on is a project of no little effort. And before we embark on that project, it would help me to understand if we had some sort of listing of the pro arguments and the con arguments for a historical district. I mean, it seems to me among the pro arguments would be, back in the 80s, we had this abortive attempt to do a historical district, and it should be at least knowable what opportunities and fixtures or landmarks have been lost in the intervening time. What does a historical designation do in terms of positioning the city for grant assistance, how it improves the city's ability to market itself, all of those things. I think that to the comment that a lot of things have changed in Placerville, I think that's true. I think that Placerville is a victim of somewhat of its own success on being on a major arterial. You know, it's a limited access highway all the way up here, and it's one of the largest corridors up to certainly South Lake Tahoe. So I think we didn't have the advantage of being a time in a bottle kind of place like maybe Sutter Creek or any other towns that, you know, if they're off the beaten path, it's a little easier to maintain that ever unchanging facade. But anyway, before we, you know, a lot of energy goes up as heat, I'd like to have a little bit of understanding of what the value proposition is for a historical district. And if I haven't been paying attention, I apologize.
Do members of the Historical Advisory Committee want to step in perhaps to address the question that Member Lowry raised?
Being the newest member to the Historic Advisory Committee, I had the same questions. Like, you know, how does this pass the so what test in terms of, you know, why should this be done? Why should it be done now? And it only took me about 15 minutes of on the internet machine sort of asking that question. I mean, what's the value of historic preservation? And there's all kinds of data that shows that heritage tourism that results from setting up downtown districts, increased community pride, all that kind of stuff. I'm not the articulate spokesman for the process, but I was convinced pretty quickly that it made a lot of sense. And but I do think it's an excellent question, and we should kind of have the bullet points sheet at some point that addresses those kind of concerns as well as what Sue was asking about. But I'm sitting here also thinking that, and having been involved with this just kind of for about a year, that we're in a situation where, you know, at some point we have to kind of put a stake in the ground and get something done, is the way I look at it. And, you know, I'm not saying that we go off half-cocked and just do something just to do it. But it's to me, this kind of all feels like, you know, sometimes feels like perfection is going to be the enemy of good. It makes a whole lot of sense to me as you know, I've only been here for 25 years, so I recognize I'm a rookie compared to some folks, but it hasn't been done for 25 years. It's been talked about, and I think we're kind of, you know, we have there's a responsibility that we have to, even though it's kind of scary and different, and we're in this horrible economic environment, and we're also in a really bad, you know, I'm overgeneralizing, of course, but we're in an environment where nobody trusts anybody else, whether it's the government or the public or whatever. But this is something really important. I want my kids and new grandkids to be able to come back here and be proud of it, and not have it kind of, you know, look like all those communities on Highway 5 and on Highway 99 that got overrun by the freeway. I mean, we have a great opportunity, but we got to figure out how to do it. And I see this as a first step to establish the district, and then figure out what the rules are going to be for that district. There's some rules that exist anyway in the current sign ordinance, the current zoning ordinance, et cetera, and our you know, the rest of our city code. But now we're going to just kind of focus a little more on the downtown district with, you know, with all due respect to the property owners. I wish I was a property owner downtown, by the way, that would have the questions and concerns about, well, what does it mean to me and what's it going to cost? But I think this begins with, this is the area we want to protect. Now let's have the discussion about how to do it and kind of please everyone. It's a, you know, it's a task worthy of Solomon to try to figure out how to help, you know, solve everyone's problems. But I just think, you know, if we don't do it and kind of figure it out, who's going to do it and when?
Could I add something? Yeah. I know the video is a little hard to understand all the way through, but we had a list, I believe, starting out of about 20-something myths and facts, sort of to, for example, is historic designated property protected forever from being demolished? That was one of the questions. And then we answered that on the video. Well, there's a whole list of other myths and facts that we have written up, and we chose the ones to put on the video that were more pertinent. So we do have that list, and you can also go to a couple of websites that are absolutely fabulous. How historic districts work, how stuff works, historic districts. The town of Quincy has a wonderful downtown business explanation of how they work theirs. Boston, Mass has one. And just for general information, Wikipedia, but there's so much information on the websites on how each individual town works, and that I would recommend you going to the websites to get real specific information. And then also, maybe it would behoove us to print out, as a printout for people, the list of myths and facts to answer more of your detailed questions. And then any historic change that would take place, especially like with a facade, which we focus on, of a building, that you could refer to chapter 14 of the development guide, and it has detailed explanation on how to present your building or your project to the committee, and then how it works up through the to the city council.
I just have a comment on our own city documents, the Community Development Guide, historical guidelines, versus the Secretary of the Interior's. I would like it stated somewhere that the Secretary of the Interior guidelines are subservient to everything else the city has as a layer. So if there comes a conflict or a question, yes, our development guide or our historical guidelines override if there is a conflict. Because I think there is a conflict right now with the Secretary of Interior guidelines saying that new work must stand distinctly separate from the old, not try to mimic, and our general plan says the exact opposite. So, and does anyone know if the old bridge coming into town on the west end is on the historical resource inventory? If not, is somebody going to get the ball rolling on that to include it on there? And then did the historical...
It's not been surveyed, no.
It's
not been surveyed formally, but when Caltrans did the Highway 50 ops, they operations project, excuse me, pardon my truncating that information, but they did do a very cursory review of that structure, but their project avoided it. So, but I don't think the survey that they did would constitute it being sent to the state for such a designation. But certainly the city, if the city wished to determine it, so there might be adequate information to do that. And that's something our Historical Advisory Committee could certainly discuss at some future time. Absolutely.
And then also as another layer is the Scenic Highway 50, I believe. You have your view shed. So that's another layer of review if somebody wants to come in and build something modern in the historic downtown district. All right, that's good.
Ms. Wager? No. Okay, seeing none and hearing none, I will move on quickly to the process. Some of it was covered in the video. The next slide here really talks about how we got here, which again the video mentioned. Historical Advisory Committee formally took action regarding this project and forwarded the recommendation to City Council, including the map and its boundaries. Also last month, City Council adopted a resolution of an intention that directs staff to initiate the process to actually formally amend the boundaries of the city's zoning map, as well as potentially modifying the Cedar Ravine residential historic district through the addition of 4 additional parcels. So the next steps for staff, these next steps are broken up into staff, the public, and our decision-making body and advisory bodies. I'll start with staff because really the action passed by City Council was to initiate and direct staff to begin this process. As you'll read here on the slide, the first step for staff is to determine, now that we have a boundary in which to evaluate, is to evaluate that boundary for potential environmental impacts and to prepare necessary environmental documentation if it's warranted. The second step would be, in that analysis, would be to evaluate the boundary and the proposed project for consistency with the general plan, the downtown revitalization plan, action plan. Looks like I had too many plans in that line item. Main Street streetscape design development plan, and the City of Placerville's development guide, which we've talked about earlier. So all that evaluation and assessment comes into play, and the staff prepares a report, prepares a draft zoning ordinance, draft boundary amendments or amendments to the zoning map, an environmental document if necessary, graphics, maps, and other things to support this action, and presents its report first back to the Historical Advisory Committee. The Historical Advisory Committee, was set up for just this purpose, for providing a recommendation on actions such as this. I understand that this came from them, but they have not, this option and this procedure would allow them to formally comment on staff's proposed draft ordinance, any proposed changes to the zoning ordinance, and of course the zoning map. So the Historical Advisory Committee would be given an opportunity to do that at a public meeting, and that meeting would be, we would provide notice. This gets to, I believe, Mr. Morris's question. This meeting would be noticed to property owners within 500 feet of the proposed boundaries of the site, the boundaries of the district, as well as we will attempt to try to contact and send notice to every business owner also within the boundaries of the district. Oops, go backward. Yeah, the public. As I mentioned, for the there's three different realms here that this, when this draft ordinance, draft amendments go forward. The first step, as I mentioned, would be the Historical Advisory Committee. As I mentioned, we will attempt to notice all business owners within the boundaries of the district, as well as property owners within 500 feet of the district, including the properties within the district. We will attempt to do this at each level or each step in this process. That means notification at the Historical Advisory Committee level, the Planning Commission level, which would be the next body to hear a recommendation from the Historical Advisory Committee. And the Planning Commission is advisory in this particular case to the City Council. So again, there are 3 steps in this process. All of them involve public input. All of the meetings will be open to the public. The Historical Advisory Committee is not a regulatory body. They don't have the authority to approve a project. So their meetings are all public meetings. They're not public hearings. There's a distinction. Planning Commission and City Council, those meetings will be public hearings, and as I mentioned, public will have opportunities to comment throughout the process. Finally, we don't have a timetable as to when this is going to happen. This is a city-initiated project, and I think most of you will understand that This project, and the director and I haven't spoke, but I believe he will concur that since it's city initiated, when there are private projects that are submitted to the city, those will take precedence for the city to process and get through the what some may call the rigmarole of our development review process. So as staff has time, we will work on this and get this forward as quickly as we can. But I don't have a timetable as whether or not it's going to be 6 months, 8 months, 12 months. I don't know. This is the development season, and we have started to receive more and more submittal of projects. So I think Director Rivas will concur that from a planning perspective, we want to get the private projects through the system as quickly as possible, and the city projects kind of step back a little bit while we go through the process. So this particular slide, it mentions the City Council is the ultimate decision-making body for this type of project. This is a legislative act changing the boundaries of a zoning map, changing potentially the text of the zoning ordinance. Those are both legislative actions which require City Council adoption for them to go into effect. As I mentioned before, and I'll stress again, this will be a public hearing and plenty of opportunities for public comment and input.
Yes. Sure.
Chris Payne, El Dorado County Historical Society, but also I'm a member of the city's Economic Development Advisory Committee, PEAC, P-E-A-C. What that means is that we have a vision, mission, goals and objectives, and a strategy related to economic development in the city of Placerville. Though this may be a city-initiated process, I believe it's more important than just the Historical Advisory Committee or the Planning Commission. I feel like my group has a stake in what may happen with this proposal and the timeliness of whether or not this process goes forward or not. And I actually meant the timeliness in fact that once we get started officially, I would hate to see it delayed, because economic development is important to the city of Placerville, and uncertainty and proposing something but not finishing it is not a good thing, especially when you're talking about the city and its properties. And I say that in a general way because the city's involved with my property, 327 Main Street, and certainly I want to see whatever it's decided, either go ahead and adopt this and do it correctly, but timely, and not be stuck on the staff deciding whether they have time to do it or not. The commitment that I see that the city needs to make is that we will do this, and that's considered part of the planning, I guess, list of jobs that you're responsible for. And it's a broader context than private first and city second, in my mind. And if that needs to be clarified, then I'm prepared to go to city council and get it clarified. Certainly before I would do that, I would make sure that PEAC had a chance to weigh in on this. But certainly this presentation ought to go to our Economic Development Advisory Committee as well, because our goals and objectives, some of them relate to this subject. So that's my opinion. I'm only one individual, but certainly it goes back, Andrew, to your comment about whether you have time or not, and what you can accomplish with the time that you're provided. So the prompting that I would be looking for is to find out exactly how this does fit in terms of the responsibilities that I have as a committee member of the Economic Development Advisory Committee. So I don't want to overstate it, but I don't want to understate it either. Thank you.
Okay. As a civil servant of some 25 years standing, I've watched governments at every level, state on down through municipalities, struggle with larger missions and less resources. The most famous example of that is the decision we made in 1978 with Proposition 13. And I don't dispute anyone's judgment on why it is we've chosen to do those things, but the fact remains that when you allocate less resources to any function, then you're going to see schedule effects. It's not a matter of opinion, it's just a simple fact of the matter. In project management, they talk about the iron triangle, which is scope, schedule, and resources. So if you want to get it done faster, put more resources on it, reduce the scope of your work. But I think we all need to be realistic about our expectations about what the city, as it is currently resourced, can accomplish. I just, that's kind of my hot button issue, and I'll always speak to that when the opportunity arises.
Sue Taylor, in concept, I think this is a good idea, but I worry about the implementation. And I still don't feel like I have my questions answered about what specific rules are we going by. I think it was brought up about one should overrule another, but I don't hear a discussion if that's what's going to end up happening. And I'd really like those heavy discussions to happen before we get into the process vacuum. Because once this leaves and goes just through the process, you know, I don't know when those details ever get fine-tuned. And so that's, I always am a little concerned about what rules are we actually going to be following, and maybe we'd be okay with them if we know what they are for sure. And then, you know, I always saw this as being a supportive process, not a punitive one. And, you know, I helped, in Tahoe there was a village that had certain rules, and I think they had gotten, the book got to be about 130 pages long, thick, and it was so convoluted and confusing that they didn't know what, and everybody'd argue about everything if that's where it really was interpreted. They actually asked me to come and revise that, and we got it down to about 30 pages with very clear, concise elements that you can use or not use for those type of buildings that they were looking at, and it simplified it and made it really clear cut for what people their expectations was. Pictures are tell you 1,000 words. You know, we can talk about this forever, but until you see a picture of what you're talking about is so different for everybody. So, you know, are we looking to retain the 1800s flavor or the 1940s flavor, or both? You know, if it's up to me, I'd turn this whole town into the 1800s, but I don't think that's where we're going to end up going. So, or is it okay to do both or mix? Or I like Placerville. It's kind of a mix of we had a word for it, but it's eclectic. But it, yeah, and it has and no matter who comes down there, I hear it all day long. I love this town. You know, I don't know what is it about, and I look down, and if architecturally, if you really focus on each building and all the stucco and plaster, you're thinking, okay, but people love it. There's just something about it. So I just think we need to be supportive of the building owners and help them come up with ways. And funding would be great, but I don't see that there's a lot of funding for historic preservation. So, and it is very time consuming also. Thank you.
I just want to tag on to Sue's comment. You know, along with, you know, I was asking earlier about, you know, I guess what I was asking for is a pros and cons marketing material by another name. but you know, as Sue points out, well, what the other thing occurs to me is what Sue's struggling with, and I think we're all struggling with about, is what will the ultimate process be? And I think along with the one thing, along with the marketing materials, if we can agree early on for a desired end state, you know, in the vision statement that says, yeah, this is going to be a mixture of late Civil War to pre-World War II architecture, however you define it. But I think if we can agree on what that desired end state would look like, it's a little like the moonshot. You know, in 1960, Kennedy told us what the desired end state was: put a man on the moon and return him alive. There was a lot of details worked out in the meantime, but everybody up front knew what the vision or the desired end state was.
Michael?
As to a time period, the Main streetscape design, which has already been adopted by council in 2006, designates an 1840 to 1910 time period, if that helps at all.
Any other comments? I'm going to take the chairman's prerogative and say a couple things. Peter, you've been here 25 years, you know? I moved here in the 40s, so, but that's not a big deal. I'm also a property owner downtown, and I'm just absolutely in support of how this is going to end up someday. And there's so many things to be worked out. I kind of, maybe it was Peter tonight that said that, or maybe it wasn't, but we ought to work on creating the district, the boundaries, get that established, and not hold that up while we work on all the details of how it's going to be implemented. So maybe it's a two-phased process here, but I would support going ahead with getting the district identified, adopted, and then it's going to be a long time working all the details about, you know, the federal guidelines and our guidelines and who has priority or this or that. But that's something I think that would give us a sense of accomplishment if we at least you know, establish the district and then work on the details as we go along. Something that's a little bit off the subject, the state, you know, building codes and health codes mandate that all commercial buildings have vacuum breakers to protect the water, so water can't be pulled backwards from a building into the city system. And I think that the city has been allowed to kind of skate by for a long time, but I understand that the state now is going to tell us, and they've already told us, I guess, that this has to end, and all commercial buildings in the city are going to be required to put in backflow preventers. If you walk down Main Street, you'll see that in the sidewalk there's boxes that say water. That means that the backflow preventer has to go between that meter and the building. My building has 2 meters, and most of these things, you'll see them around in landscaped areas, and they're usually about 2 feet tall, and the bigger the complex, the bigger they get. But can you imagine what it would look like if we had these things up and down Main Street, sticking up out of the sidewalk? Now, I talked to my plumber over the weekend, and apparently they can be put below grade in a vault. And I would hope that maybe the city council would instruct or direct whoever issues building permits at the city level that if you're in the historic district or the proposed historic district, that these things go below grade. And it's still gonna, you know, mess up our sidewalks because there'll have to be a vault and a cover and all these things. But you know, let's not have these things start appearing above grade because it's a little bit cheaper to put them in that way. And so hopefully the council will take some action to direct, you know, the staff to whoever processes the building permits to have these things underground. And if there's 63 buildings on that section that they're going to paint, that means there could potentially be 63 backflow preventers. It would look like the beach at Normandy, you know, when they're having the tank traps. So anyway, I think that's something that has to be addressed. And other than that, thank you for coming, unless someone has another comment or two. Chris?
Chris Payne. I was at the Board of Supervisors and they had a presentation on on the Rubicon Trail, and they had a person that was there. They were talking about getting Register of Historic Places designation for Rubicon Trail, and this person from SHPO came and spoke as to their assessment of the Rubicon Trail, and they distinctly talked about periods of time that essentially were these historic eras, and they had come up with 3, and so there were periods of time where you could make reference as to what might match, but everybody might match a different period of time. For instance, around the after World War II, the availability of Jeeps, and that whole era of the change from what they used before World War II to now they were into Jeeps, and that era is an important one, and to some people you don't want to lose that. At the same time, they could go back from there and look at the wagons and the other, they may have been the earlier vehicles, let's say motorized vehicles, and you could define a period of time where that was historically significant, and then go back into the 1800s. And so anyhow, they came up with 3 different ones, and they kind of looked to the Board of Supervisors of which one do we want? And essentially the answer back was, well, you could have all 3, because it just, from a broad perspective, we have special architecture, special features on Main Street, as described earlier by your other speakers, that are all very important to us. So I don't know that it necessarily is, as to Mike's comment, a question of, because we already have something else, maybe 1840 to 1910, when it may be a 1940s, which puts it, what, over 60 years, 70 years, significant. So that's why, as you guys talk about this as we go forward, let's be specific as to what that goal is. You know, what is it that we want to make sure that we have still here, and not necessarily one particular date period, but it could be multiple date periods. Thank you.
Following our agenda, I think that we've probably finished the comments. We have matters from members. I think we probably don't. I'm going to pass on that. But I think the matters from staff, there are a couple of comments, some things you need to do. And so we'll move on to that.
Basically, I just wanted to update the Planning Commission and also now the Historic Advisory Committee and the general public on the status of a conditional use permit that was approved by the Planning Commission back in 2007. So to give a little background, you probably recall that at the time that the city was working on improvements to the wastewater treatment plant, it had to relocate the county's animal shelter that was located adjoining the wastewater treatment plant. So back in January of 16th of 2007, the Planning Commission approved a conditional use permit to allow the county's animal shelter to operate at 511 Placerville Drive. It continues to operate there at that location without any complaints or incident. I want to call your attention that there was a condition that was placed on that conditional use permit, and the condition read that this permit is valid for a period of 2 years in the event that an extension is necessary to allow for the completion of the county's permanent animal control facility. The community development director is empowered to grant 1 6-month extension, and any extension beyond that aforementioned extension shall require planning commission authorization. So that 6-month extension was granted some time ago, and a number of extensions were granted. But I just wanted to point out to the commission, just as information, that there has been case law in regards to conditional use permits. And basically, I want to differentiate between what is a temporary use permit and a conditional use permit. Temporary use permits are temporary, just by the title. And under city code, they're not to last any longer than 1 year. And typically they're ministerial. They're not subject to the California Environmental Quality Act. With respect to a conditional use permit, case law has said that these types of permits run with the land, and they don't sunset, they don't expire. So typically, if the use is in as long as it's in compliance with the conditions of approval that were imposed by the city, it can continue on indefinitely. So I want to point that out. So I thought it would be appropriate then to talk about the success that the county is now having in moving the facility. So the county has acquired property in the Park West Business Park. It contains a 21,800 square foot commercial building. It's at 6435 Capitol Avenue, and they've actually awarded a $1.9 million construction contract to complete the facility, and the county anticipates moving the animal shelter from 511 Placerville Drive to their new location this September. So I just wanted to update you on that. Happy to answer any questions you have regarding this update. And then I have one other item that's not on the agenda. I just want to call everyone's attention that this Thursday, the City Council will have a goal-setting workshop, and that's in concert with the budget, this coming fiscal year budget, and that'll be Thursday at 5 p.m. here in Town Hall, and everybody's welcome to attend.
Steph has one more announcement. We did receive a letter from the California Department of Housing and Community Development, and they have, upon reviewing our housing element that City Council adopted earlier this year, found it in full compliance with the state's housing law, and therefore we have a certified housing element. So moving forward, projects that involve residential construction will be evaluated according to that adopted document. So we as staff are really excited to have that letter of approval or letter of certification, so to speak, from HCD.